Hello, everyone. I would like to say a warm welcome to you all. I'm Merve İspahani, the Academic Programs Coordinator at Columbia Global Centers Istanbul. We are delighted that you're joining us today as we host Professor Zeynep Çelik in conversation with Professor Rashid Khalidi on her new Europe Knows Nothing About the Orient, a Critical Discourse from the East, 1872-1932, published by Koç University Press and distributed by the University of Chicago Press in the US and Europe. We bring this conversation to you in collaboration with the Middle East Institute and the Sakıp Sabancı Center for Turkish Studies at Columbia University. Let me briefly introduce our speakers. Zeynep Çelik is a distinguished professor emerita at the New Jersey Institute of Technology and an adjunct professor of history at Columbia University. She is the author of many books, including The Remaking of Istanbul, Displaying the Orient, Urban Forms and Colonial Confrontations, Empire, Architecture and the City, and about Antiquities, Politics of Archaeology in the Ottoman Empire. In 2019, Professor Çelik received the Giorgio Levi della Vida Medal, honoring outstanding achievement in Islamic studies. Rashid Khalidi is the Edward Said Professor of Arab Studies at Columbia University. He is the co-editor of the Journal of Palestine Studies and has served as president of the Middle East Studies Associations. His publications include Brokers of Deceit, How the US Has Undermined Peace in the Middle East, Palestinian Identity and Solving Crisis, and American Dominance and the Cold War in the Middle East, and most recently, the 100 Years' War on Palestine. Before we move on to our talk, I would like to remind you that we will have time for your questions in the end, so please feel free to post your questions on the Q&A function. We are excited to start our discussion, so now I would like to leave the floor to Professor Khalidi. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Merve. Thank you to everybody who is attending virtually. We've all gotten used to this very peculiar form of getting together. I see we have almost 200 participants already. I'm very glad to be presenting this enormously, well, first of all, a beautiful book, but enormously learned book, which I think does something that very, very few authors have actually tried to do, which is to take some of the insights of Edward Said's famous book, Orientalism, which we all know well, and to, as it were, turn them around. In this book, I think Professor Çelik is doing something that Edward Said did not try to do in Orientalism, which is to turn the gaze back on the West from a vantage point in the East. What she does thereby is not only to provide a critique of Western Orientalism from an Ottoman and Turkish perspective, but also a view of the West, looking at how the West looks at others, which is something that Said did from, as it were, from the West. He himself was someone born and brought up in the Middle East, but who was writing from the vantage point of an American university, from a perspective of American academic training in high school, in his undergraduate education at Princeton, and later his graduate training at Harvard, and was looking essentially from the West at how the West looked at other parts of the world, perhaps with a unique perspective because of his background, but nevertheless grounding that in a Western analysis of Western writings about this part of the world, about the Orient, so-called, about the Middle East. What Professor Çelik is doing here is really quite unique. She is taking texts, and this is a book which has both a long and rich introduction by Zeynep Çelik, but she is also taking and has gone to enormous lengths to translate texts by Ottoman and Turkish authors during the period covered by the book from 1872 until 1932. And thereby gives us not just her analysis, which she does, of course, in the introduction, but puts us into the writings and into, in some cases, the images presented by people in the so-called Orient, talking about how they were seen or perceived or misperceived by the Western other. This is really quite a unique. This is quite a unique book in that respect. It has a few other characteristics that I just want to point to before I hand over to Professor Çelik, after which I'll be asking her a few questions. One of the things that most surprised me, and I'll ask her a question about this later on. One of the things that most surprised me when I actually got the printed book, I had seen previously page proofs or an early version of it, was the richness of some of the illustrations. She's looking at the gaze, not just on the printed page. She's looking at a critical perspective, Ottoman Turkish perspective on the Western gaze at Turkey and the East, not just via texts, though she gives a plenitude of wonderful texts in which Ottoman and Turkish authors critique and in some cases quite sarcastically comment on Western views. But she also shows images, and that's one of the wonderful things about this book that I didn't realize when I saw it, I guess, in page proofs. She mentioned to me, she told me, yes, it'll be richly illustrated, but I had no idea until I actually received the physical book, quite how rich that was. And of course, this is characteristic of Professor Çelik's work. She doesn't just write things, she shows us things, and she writes about the things she shows us in all of her work. Marwa mentioned a few of her books, and each one of them has that same attention, not just to describing things textually, but showing us things and then explaining what we are seeing. And that's one of the wonderful things about this book, from the delightful cover to the illustrations of every single one of the authors at the very end. We can actually see the faces of the people whose words we're reading. And I wish more authors, especially people who are talking about things like the Western gaze or perceptions or whatever, had the same attention to this kind of thing. I want to say one more thing before I hand over to Professor Çelik to talk about her own work, which is the fact that this book, which was produced, as Merve said, by Koç University Press, and I should say meticulously and beautifully produced by the press, is being distributed in the United States by the University of Chicago Press. However, unfortunately, partly due to shipping problems, customs problems, whatever, the book is not yet fully available in the United States. So I am sorry to tell you that you may have to wait. You should order it immediately. It is a wonderful addition to your library, but you may have to wait to receive it, unfortunately. There is a worldwide shipping problem, partly caused by the Suez Canal issue, partly caused by the lack of containers, partly caused by the fact that everybody is buying stuff that they weren't buying before. And this may also be due to issues in the United States with customs or with clearance. But in any case, hopefully very soon the book will be available. And I cannot strongly enough urge you to acquire this book. It really is, it's a lovely book and it's a unique book. I don't think I've ever seen, I've read, since I read Orientalism when it was first published in 1978, I've read many, many, many books which purport to talk about some of the issues that Edward Said first opened up. And I think this is a unique take on that, not just because it's giving this Ottoman Turkish perspective, but because it turns the tables entirely. And it gives us both these unique writings, but also enables us to see the whole topic from a completely different vantage point, from a completely different perspective. Let me stop here. I could talk a great deal about this book, which I think is quite a wonderful contribution to scholarship. But let me hand over now to Professor Çelik, let her talk a little bit about her own work, and then I will ask her a few questions, and then we'll have questions from the audience. So Zeynep, please take it away.
Welcome to everybody, and thank you very much for these very generous introductions. I would also like to thank Colombia's Istanbul Global Center, the Middle East Institute, and the Sakıp Sabancı Center for organizing this conversation. I am, of course, very grateful to Rashid Khalidi for accepting to discuss the book with me. Indeed, he has done such a presentation that I could not do that myself. So thank you very much, Rashid, and I will try. I think you gave all the essence of the book in a few wonderful sentences there. Thank you again. Let me begin with the title of the book. Europe does not know and knows nothing about the Orient. In Turkish, Avrupa şarkı bilmez. This is the cri de coeur of Ottoman intellectual Namık Kemal and the title of his famous article published in 1872. Namık Kemal's short essay marked the beginning of a passionate Ottoman discourse that targeted the misrepresentations, distortions, and factual errors of European authors who wrote about the history and culture of the Ottoman Empire and about Islam. Worldly, cosmopolitan, and engaged in projects of modernity, late 19th and early 20th century intellectuals in Istanbul did not, in fact, could not remain passive to the European literature on the Orient. They voiced their reactions in scholarly and popular periodicals and books, spreading over different genres of writing, from political commentary to literary criticism, novels, satires, and poetry. Charged with their own ideological agendas, the late Ottoman and early Turkish Republican intellectuals turned and twisted the cultural debates to serve their own ends. But their opinions coalesced into a non-submissive ensemble, albeit one only heard locally. Their discourse was fragmented, it surfaced in unexpected places, and it was expressed in a powerful and often angry language. Listening to their tirades now fills some gaps in the historiography of Orientalist criticism. The time bracket covered in the book is from 1872 to 1932. These decades were marked by both many wars with disastrous consequences for the Ottoman Empire and major political and ideological shifts. The wars with Russia, 1877-78, and Italy, 1911, the Balkan Wars, 1912-13, the World War I, and the War of Independence from 1919 to 1922, each ended with significant losses of land, the last two sealing the empire's demise. The political front went through two constitutional regimes, the first from 76 to 78 and from 1908 to 1920. In between was the long and controversial reign of Abdülhamid II from 1876 to 1909. Then there is the foundation of the Grand National Assembly of Turkey, 1921, and finally of the Turkish Republic, 1923, followed by the Lausanne Treaty that acknowledged it in 1924. Dominant ideological positions oscillated between Ottomanism, Turkism, Turanism, Islamism, nationalism, secularism, modernism, statism, liberalism, and their myriad interpretations with significant overlaps between them. It is not easy to imagine the mindsets of the individuals caught up in this storm. In his memoirs titled Suyu Arayan Adam, The Man Who Searched Water, Şevket Süreyya Aydemir gave some insights through his own life experience. As a young man, he wrote, he listened to the fairy tale of an empire, then found himself in a short-lived state of intoxication with freedom, sought a legendary Turkey through Turanism, flirted with Bolshevism, and ended up at peace with the Turkish Republican ideology, all the while searching for water, his metaphor for an ideal. His contemporaries must have all confronted such intellectual upheavals. Were there threads that united them? Could they define themselves according to a broad identity? Looking at this diverse group of men and women from my distance in the second decade of the 21st century, I would like to suggest very cautiously that their rebuttals of Orientalism constitute one common ground, but not a collective identity. I must turn here to Edward Said's Orientalism, as that book is essential to understand this one. The origins of Europe knows nothing about the Orient go back 40 years to the days when Orientalism rocked the university campuses, among them the University of California in Berkeley, where I was a graduate student. Like everybody else around me, I fell under the spell of the book, and I became immersed in the debates it generated. Among them, one particularly resonated with me: the absence of voices from the East. I knew it was not all quiet on that front, and Said's arguments provoked me to think about it. I started collecting bits and pieces of responses to Orientalism from the Turkish side. These were the first steps toward the current book. The self-containment of the late Ottoman, early Turkish Republican discourse forms a dramatic contrast to the torrential reception of Said's book, even though the earlier literature in Turkish shared Orientalism's essential positions. There are many obvious reasons for the dissimilar reception of the two, including Orientalism's methodological integrity, its depth of scholarly research, the political and sociocultural climate surrounding its production, and of course, the universality of the English language. The uncovering of the earlier criticism of Orientalism coming from the Orient and from people who constituted the subjects of the European discourse does not reduce the importance of Said's work. On the contrary, it is thanks to the turmoil Said fueled that the significance of the earlier work surfaces. The texts in Turkish share Said's positions on a multiple of ways, yet they barely intersect with Orientalism's case studies. In fact, there are only two overlaps. The first, Ernest Renan, is one of Said's main subjects. Said examines Renan's manipulations of philology, his essentialist views of Islam, his racial ideas, and his understanding of science, making references to his many publications. Curiously, L'Islamisme et la Science, the text of a lecture Renan delivered at the Sorbonne in 1883, is not among them. By contrast, L'Islamisme et la Science is the object of Namık Kemal's attack in his booklet titled Refutation of Renan. The second overlap, Pierre Loti, gets two quick and dismissive mentions in Said, but opens up a vast field of responses from the Ottoman Turkish side. Despite the scarcity of shared case studies, criticism from the Orient covers a familiar Saidian list of issues: representations of religion and society, lack of knowledge, Eurocentrism, cultural hierarchy, colonialism, imperialism, exoticism, sensationalism, imagination, and an overarching essentialism. I discussed this theme in an introductory essay to Europe Knows Nothing About the Orient. This is followed by a reader, a collection of key texts from late Ottoman Turkish intellectuals who come together as united against European representations of the East. As I mentioned before, the authors represent a wide ideological spectrum. To mention a few, Tevfik Fikret, an outspoken poet of Edebiyat-ı Cedide, New Literature movement, known for his opposition to Abdülhamid II, is joined by Halit Ziya, a legendary novelist from the same literary movement, but with a much toned down political voice, if one at all. Famously remembered for their attacks on each other, poets Nazım Hikmet and Ahmet Haşim stood on the opposite poles of the political spectrum. The former a devoted communist and the latter an individualist symbolist with a firm belief in capitalism. Male voices are in majority, but there are several women writers in the group, among them the well-known novelist and essayist Halide Edip and Fatma Aliye. We have in this book an unlikely gathering of Ottoman Turkish intellectuals. I don't believe Nazım Hikmet and Fatma Aliye Hanım or Halit Ziya and Şevket Süreyya appeared in company of each other before. The overall group portrait that we have here is rather unique. The uniqueness saying something about the complexity of the broader intellectual scene. I could really go on, but I better stop here and give the word to Rashid, and I'll try to answer his questions.
Wonderful. I mean, I have a number of basic questions. And the first, you sort of hinted at it in your description of your initial response to the Said book, to Orientalism. But could you say a little bit more about how this book came about, what it was that led you to write it? This is a really major endeavor in the sense of collecting texts, translating them, thinking about which ones to include, and also images. What made you undertake this really quite remarkable amount of scholarly labor?
Well, as I said, it has been cooking on for a long time, for 40 years. And I do remember those very lively debates on campus at Berkeley. So there is that. But something more concrete happened. On the 40th anniversary of the publication of Orientalism, the editor of the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians asked me to write an editorial piece on how Said's arguments affected architectural and art history. Well, Said had really not dealt with these topics at all, except that the cover is so striking. Nonetheless, his thinking influenced architectural history and art history tremendously and produced a very lively debate. And it's interesting that this was not only about representation of the non-Western, but also the way architectural history was written in general. So he did have an impact, and I wrote about that. And once I wrote that piece, a couple of colleagues told me I should develop it into a more comprehensive work. And I'm very grateful to them for encouraging me and making me, convincing me that this would fill in a lacuna. In fact, as I mentioned it to other colleagues, the response was always, do it, Zeynep, because you're going to be also providing us with some primary texts here.
Great. Another question relates to something that I mentioned in my own brief introduction, which is that this is quite a copiously illustrated book. I mean, having read many of your other books, I'm not entirely surprised, because you're always trying to deal with texts and images and so forth in your own work. But you could easily have made this simply a dry collection of texts. And instead, you copiously illustrated it. Do you want to say a little bit about this? Because it's not just what Ottoman and Turkish thinkers and writers said. You show how they looked back, as it were, at the West. And can you say a little bit about the illustrations in this book? I mean, they're only a part of the book, but if you could say just a little bit about what led you to do this way.
Thank you very much for bringing this up, because I believe that visual material is often treated as stepchildren in books that deal with historic topics, whereas I use them as primary documents. Mm-hmm. So, and the material that was covered by the text was begging for visual complementation in this case. And after all, I am a historian of visual culture. If I may open this a little bit, there are three types of illustrations in the book. The first category are the illustrations that are in the original text, and these come from the art historical critiques, and that's a very important section of the book, and I'd like our readers to take it very seriously. The second one is what we call the separators. Each section of the book is summarized in a way by one illustration.
Here's an example of one.
Oh, the submissive woman. I love that one. Yes.
I'm sure you can see it, but anyway.
Mother of the family sitting there in the center. It's a fantastic photograph. And we wanted submissive photographs for this. We did not have to go far because Ömer Koç has a fabulous collection of photographs, and he generously shared it with us through his colleague and friend Bahattin Tuncay. All I had to do was to go to Bahattin and say, this is what we're working on. And he immediately provided me with a set of photographs to select from. So we were lucky and we were not short on materials. As to the cover, it comes from Rana Alpöz's private collection. It's a photograph of the baby. In the photograph is his grandfather. And there is a very touching story behind it. Yet I love the whole team loved the look of wonder in those two characters' gaze. The third set of photographs are in the appendix. And these are, first of all, doing the English edition, we felt urged to provide the covers of the illustrations for the English readers. And they are really quite wonderful. They include pages which use titles which use Kufic calligraphy to,
or other calligraphy.
Or other, there is even one in constructivist aesthetics there. So there we go, the cadro. Quite a variety, which helps to describe the liveliness of the intellectual and cultural scene. We also added for the English version short biographies of short biographies of the authors with a little photograph of each one of them. So these constitute the main category, all of the categories of the photographs.
As someone who has done a great deal of research in the newspapers of the late Ottoman period, in Beirut and Damascus, actually in Istanbul and other parts of the Ottoman Empire before World War I particularly appreciated seeing the front pages of some of the newspapers that are referred to. I really think this is a wonderful addition to the book. Let me only ask a couple more questions. Sorry, go ahead, Zeynep.
No, it's also interesting. You know, we had the idea, but we didn't really know where we were going to get to. Once we collected all of them, as a team, we said, wow, this looks great aesthetically.
It does, absolutely. I'm going to only ask a couple more questions because I assume we're going to be getting, yes, we are beginning to get questions in the Q&A. So I will ask a couple of more questions. You bring gender into this story in a section of the book that's entitled Oriental, in quotes, Women and Life at Home. Can you say something about the importance of this section of the book? You mentioned that only a few of the authors are women, but I think it's worth at least stopping here and saying a few words about this aspect of the book, because it's so important to the Orientalist gaze, gender and sexuality, and the reverse view of how from the Ottoman perspective, from the Turkish perspective of this, is one of the things you focus on. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yes, of course, there was no way I could omit that theme, because it is the big obsession, the big Orientalist obsession. However, it was so interesting to me that even in the critique of, say, European writing of history of the Ottoman Empire, this came up. The Ottomans who spoke back had something to say about the misrepresentation of misunderstanding of women in Islamic societies. Every one of them did it. In all of our texts, it comes up. Some deal with it more comprehensively than others, and their goal is to break down the stereotypes. And of course, they do them with their own agendas, so the correctives may not necessarily represent the truth, but that's besides the point. The point is that it's all attacked. It's really, really important to look at the text of Fatma Aliye Hanım, who creates these hypothetical scenarios. The scenarios are about European women from all sectors of the European society coming to visit her in her home. And they ask her questions. And of course, they ask all the wrong questions, and she corrects every one of them. It's amusing, it's didactic, it is manipulative. However, it is also very systematic. Others do it as well, not as systematically as Fatma Aliye Hanım in his book titled Women of Islam.
Let me ask maybe one more question, or maybe two. I mean, having just published a book with just a few illustrations myself, and it's actually the first time I published a book with illustrations. So I've been remiss in the past. I realize how much work is involved. And so you not only had, in terms of production of this book, you not only have that concern, which is something I know you've dealt with in the many books you've written previously, but you also had a concern about translation. And I noticed that there are 5 translators listed. Do you want to, and you mentioned several times the team that was working with you. Do you want to say a little bit about production issues, and a little bit about translations, and a little bit about the team that was involved in the production of this quite beautiful book?
All books are teamwork, but this is particularly, it's so how shall I put this? I cannot thank my team enough because we worked as a group of people, and there are many, many of us, and there are so many stages of it. In fact, we did another webinar on the making of this book, which I think you can access easily through Istanbul Global Centers. Now, yes, translation was a very major issue, and we have so many translations. We had the doctors who did the basic translations, and then they were edited. We have a very seasoned translator, Aron Aji, who accepted graciously to serve as our translation editor. The goal was to make sure that the different voices of the authors were heard, because the way Namık Kemal writes in the 1870s is so different than the way Nazım Hikmet writes in the 1920s. And to do justice to their voices involved so much work, and we went back and forth so many times. And all of these were made possible through Koç University Press and a wonderful manager. She managed all of us in our communications. So it really was a very cumbersome process. And for the other seminar, I developed a diagram showing how the arrows went back and forth. And I think you would be amused to look at this. We selected the images with the team in Koç University Press. And I'm, again, extremely grateful to the press for allowing us, giving us all these resources.
Yeah, wonderful. I have a couple more questions, but I see we only have about 20 more minutes, and I've noticed a large number of questions in the Q&A. So let me take, I'm sure I won't be able to get to all of the questions, but let me take a couple of the questions. My colleague here at Columbia, Professor Shen, asks, many of the questioners thank you for your contribution and for the talk. I won't repeat that. And many of them congratulate you, as does Professor Shen. He wonders whether there are any future plans to extend the scope of this book further and have another collaborative volume, or even more than one volume, of similar writings in Arabic, Persian, or other languages spoken in former Ottoman territories.
Oh, thank you very much, Tunç, for bringing that up. I meant to mention it in my presentation, but I forgot. I offer this book as open-ended. There is no full stop at the end of this book. I know for sure that I did not cover everything. I did not include all the texts written in Turkish on this, but I also bring here and there a few others from Arab writers in the Middle East and North Africa. And my hope is that this open-ended book will be continued with proposals with other texts from other geographies and other languages. So certainly it's not a finished project. It's just the beginning of something. I don't know that I can do this, but I think there are ways of continuing this project.
Right. There's another question from Jesse Howell, who again thanks you and says that in your exploration of these writings by Ottoman and Turkish writers, did you consider the simultaneous troubling intellectual attitudes towards people even further to the east? I'm thinking of the quasi-Orientalist treatment of Arabs, Kurds, Persians, and others. And you've basically answered that question. Let me pose another question to you. This is from Sharon Mizbani. This is a complicated question. How do you see your own positionality in relationship to these texts and the contemporary state of the field? It sounds like an anthropologist asking this question. Do you see I may be wrong, do you see the authors as your companions, drawing from Azulai's work, Unlearning Imperialism, where she says unlearning imperialism is asking not how it could be opposed tomorrow, but how it was opposed yesterday? Do you see this project itself as a form of speaking back? Complicated question.
It is an interesting question because it's also very personal. It is part of my formation, being defined from the outside, but and that complicates this whole question of identity, which I don't think is a very good paradigm anyway. But how can I, she's an art historian, she's not an anthropologist. I would say that I see myself as on one hand, as being produced by that discourse that I'm including in this book, but on the other, from the other side, because I've had a very Western education. And I do remember my father, if I may go back to him, I was complaining about how I was in an English school and I was complaining how we had to learn both the English stuff and then the Turkish stuff. And he said, this is our destiny, girl. You have to do both. So I am a product of this, but I must say Orientalism is not dead. We experience it all the time. At many dinner conversations, it comes up. It is a continuing saga, which of course forms helps me form my reaction to it. I'm not as angry as the Ottoman intellectuals, but sometimes I do get as angry.
Yes, the blurb from Orhan Pamuk calls them actually angry on the back of the book. Here's a question that Merve sent me, and let me pose it to you. In the book, Professor Çelik demonstrates the importance of texts written by late Ottoman and Turkish intellectuals as they were critical of Orientalism. She also mentions Ottoman Orientalism, as some Ottoman intellectuals used a somewhat similar Orientalist discourse in their relations with the Arab populations and Kurdish, actually, also populations of the empire. There's a wonderful article on this. Anyway, recent studies also talk about Ottoman Orientalism and how Ottomans used a similar civilizing mission discourse, Medeni versus Bedawi, Turkish Arabic. Does she think there is also a need to read Arab sources more closely, especially by Ottoman historians, to see how Arab intellectuals responded to Ottoman Orientalism? I'm thinking of Selim Derengil's wonderful article, They Live in a State of Savagery.
Yeah.
Please, do you have a response to this?
Well, I did not want to get into Ottoman Orientalism, but I have only one paragraph in my introduction about it. It is something I also tried to deal with in my Empire, Architecture, and the City book. It is a very strong tendency among late Ottoman intellectuals to think along the way of Europe, just like they learned it from Europe. And they think along the same lines. You read about Ottomans writing on Bedouis and you think, am I reading the French writing about the Algerian countryside? So it's certainly a very important topic and it's part of this larger discussion. It goes on today. We have the repercussions in today's discourses. And of course, it would be terrific if scholars of Arabic productions would look at this from that side. I don't know that it has been done. Ottoman historians have started looking at it, but I don't know if it's coming from the Arab sources as well.
I'm positive there's material there, but I don't know if any scholarship has actually been done. Perhaps there has been. There are a couple more really good questions here, and we can go for a little bit, hopefully a little bit longer, because I see a number of really good questions. I mean, they're all good, but I hope we'll be able to get to as many of them as we can. This is from one of our PhD students, Yasemin Akçagöner. She says, how do you see this book as speaking to the scholarship of Bernard Lewis? One of the important critiques of the Lewis-Said debate, which took place among many other places at Mesa in Boston in 1984, took place in the pages of New York Review of Books and many other places. One of the important critiques of the Lewis-Said debate is that they are speaking past each other. Said draws most of his cases from the Arabophone Middle East, while Lewis draws his from the Turcophone. Does the selection of Turcophone thinkers here, is it a deliberate response to Lewis as well?
Oh, I think so. I think so, and there is a footnote in my book which brings Bernard Lewis. I don't want to talk about him, but there is a footnote which brings him into this context. We included a short story, a satirical short story called The Hidden Sanctuary. It's very entertaining. And we translated the whole thing. Now, the interesting thing is that Bernard Lewis had translated this, I forget the year, but I think it was after their big controversy, and published it in Die Welt des Islam. Without any introduction, without anything. And I felt this was one of those nagging attacks by Lewis on Edward Said, saying, look, they've done it before you did. But of course, it's a very simplistic way of looking at things, I would say, from Bernard Lewis's side. Yeah, I do hope that this speaks back to Bernard Lewis as well, because the modernization of Turkey that he describes has no room for this.
Right. Another question from Nicole Van Os. Everybody says they thank you for this. I have a question about the intended audience of the sources used, in other words, the things that you translate. So, for example, was Fatma Alia's book on Muslim women intended for an Ottoman or European readership, according to you? And what about women and men writing for a European readership, trying to explain about the Ottoman world and its women, or addressing European audiences at events such as international conferences, for example, Salma Riza or Hayriye Ben Ayad?
Okay, this is another good question, and the answer can be very long. I'll try to make it concise. Taking Fatma Aliye Hanım's book, it was written in, it was, I don't know when it was published, 1893. And it was translated into French. There is a very interesting French translation of it. It's not a bad translation. And it was sent to the Chicago World's Fairs to be included in the Women's Pavilion there. It made no splash whatsoever. However, it was meant as a way of disseminating this message to a broader audience. At the same time, of course, the Ottoman Empire was being represented in rather Orientalist ways in Chicago, and not so Orientalist ways as well. But this book is part of that speaking back, and there were other publications along the same line here. As to Ottoman writers, writing for Europeans, this is also very interesting. Some of the texts that we translated and included in the book are not from Turkish, but from French. And they were published in Turkish journals, and they address the very specifically French issues of representing the Orient. Pierre Loti, for example, is attacked in French in several articles, and detailed articles. Did he read them? Did he care? I don't think so. Of course, Pierre Loti claimed he knew Turkish as well, but I don't think he knew. Well, our authors say he did not. But even those articles published in French did not cause any reaction from the European side.
There's a related question by Nilüfer Ertan. What was the main objection of Ottoman Turkish intellectuals to the misperception of themselves? Conversely, were they aware that they and similar countries were nevertheless constructing their modern identity through the West's gaze? Those are two quite complicated questions. I don't know how quickly you can answer them. Those are big questions.
I think the second part of the question we already answered earlier.
Yeah, actually, yes.
And the first part was what?
What was the main objection of Ottoman Turkish intellectuals to the misperception of themselves?
They did not like, if I may answer this in a rather formulaic and simplistic manner. They did not like the way they were Orientalized because they considered themselves Western.
Yeah.
But it's really not fair to say that, because you go into and you read Namık Kemal's refutation of Renan, you understand the respect and the depth in the understanding of Islam and the culture that it created. It's not always that they wanted to be European, but really so much was misunderstood. And about the institutions, the institution of the family, so misunderstood. And not that the Ottoman intellectuals were claiming that the Turkish family was like the European family, but it was misunderstood.
There are a couple of questions that relate to what I'm about to ask you. This one is from Eda Güçlü. Sorry. She asks, how do you see the position of Ottoman Greek and Armenian communities in this discussion? Could that also be a part of possible future projects? Not necessarily by you, perhaps. But anyway, there's a related question, but why don't you just answer that one?
Yeah, let me answer this question. I do not know Greek and Armenian, so I could not look at those texts. But we had another webinar with literary critics in Turkish, and one of them, who is an expert on Armenian literature, said that he could think of a series of books by Armenian authors who criticized Orientalism, especially the missionaries, along similar lines. And he was talking about parallel texts, which certainly could enhance our message here, our bigger message.
Yeah, what you've just said now and what was asked about other languages really would involve a series of projects because of the language expertise that would be necessary, and also I think the art historical / archaeological and architectural expertise that would be necessary to put together similar books for how Greek communities, Armenian communities, Arab communities, Kurdish communities, other communities speaking other languages within the Ottoman Empire viewed this issue of how they were seen by the West. But it would have to be a project, a series really of projects. It's not one project because of the expertise involved. There's a question from Iman Ghanim. I'm just throwing it in because it relates to what I just said. She's a PhD candidate at the University of Jordan. And she says, first of all, she says, how does your book contribute to the realm of Orientalism and cultural studies? I think you've answered that. And her question to Professor Khalidi, is it possible to see any collaboration between you and Professor Çelik? Well, we haven't talked about that.
But once again, the broader project surpasses me. I can't do this.
Obviously.
But I'm hoping that there will be echoes of this modest book.
Well, I hope so. Here is a question by Nora Fisher-Onar. The anger you described, anger is actually the term used by one of the blurbs on the book. I don't think
I think I use it
you
too.
use the term. Oh, then Orhan picked it up. Okay, I didn't notice that. Sorry. And then the questioner is of course right. The anger, I'll read her question. The anger you describe with figures from this period has echoes in resentments of neo-Orientalism today. Do you see any vectors via which the critiques you engage are channeled or appropriated in current debates about Turkey's geocultural positionality? In what ways, if any, are the ideas you surface being appropriated by thinkers today? It's a complex question.
It's a complex question which I wanted to avoid desperately. And it is this question, and I even mention it in my introduction. I say, history is not always so easy to translate into present day. And I'm very cautious about drawing very quick parallels here. Having said that, and having mentioned already that Orientalism is not dead, it appears in different ways, and it would be a good project to look at the problem from today's perspective. It's not the same. The world has changed so much. Europe is no longer the center. Where is the center? The center shifts every day. So I would be very cautious in jumping from 1900 to present day. But it is a question I cannot avoid, and every time it's asked. And I mean, I'm very, very, very reluctant to link today's political scene to the one 100 years ago.
There's another question along these lines, and you've really answered it. I'm just going to read it. I don't think you need to answer it. But if you want to, you can. My question concerns Ottoman and Turkish statesmen. What was their response to Ottoman and Turkish intellectuals' rebuttals of Orientalism? So that's a separate question. And then he goes, the questioner, it's Bilge Yesil, goes on to say, did they embrace these critiques and or use them for their own political projects? Then the questioner says, the reason I ask is because the Erdogan government is constantly critiquing the West on the basis of Islamophobia. That part you've answered. So perhaps the first part of the question.
Leave the Erdogan part out.
Yes.
And I will answer the other one.
The first part.
It is also very interesting when you look at the little synopses we give for each one of these journals. First of all, they're not continuous. They're closed all, and then they're opened again. There's censorship on them. So there is a government control over the publications continuously through this period. And we are also talking about the same individuals moving from journal to journal. You know, and how many journals did Tevfik Fikret write? So that kind of weird mobility says so much about the government control over the production of knowledge and intellectual discourse. There are pacts made with the government. For example, if a journal has a continued presence without being closed, it shows that there was an agreement not to publish certain art. Servet-i-Fünun is one of those very famous journals, and Servet-i-Fünun made a pact. So no controversial topics were included there. It's also interesting, the poets especially, how strong they are in their fights and how they don't give up and how strongly they use their language. They all and they're included in our book.
Let me ask you one more question about audience. It's not quite the same as as an earlier question. It's from Ziwen Yang. Thank you for presentation. I wonder if there was an audience these Ottoman intellectuals had in mind. Who were they talking to? Was there an emerging space of public debate that was somehow new? And I think this last part of the question is interesting. I mean, it's something that I myself am very interested in my own work, because one of the things I've argued is that, yes, there was an emerging space of public debate. But do you want to say something about this?
Yeah, I think there was an emerging space and it was getting wider. The literacy rate was still quite low, but there is a wonderful scene described by Tanpınar, Ahmet Hamdi Tanpınar, in one of his books on literary criticism. And he talks about how every night the families got together and the ones who went to school who knew how to read to the rest, to the family. So I am beginning to think that it is not so important to link the audience, the readership, to literacy. It went beyond that. And these journals were published, they were sold, they were distributed all over the Hence, I don't know the numbers necessarily, but they also pass from hand to hand. There is a publishing industry. Books are translated, so it is it's quite a lively scene. In fact, just considering the number of journals published for women in the late 19th century, it's really a big scene that we're talking about. You muted yourself, Rashid.
Sorry, you're absolutely right. I was doing research in Damascus many years ago, and in the Zahiriya library and the Assad library, I found an enormous number of journals in Arabic for women, some published by men, some published by women. I was really surprised by the number I found. This is in the pre-World War I period, which is what I was looking at the time. And I have to say, I think you've made a very, very important point, because in a debate over the importance of the press at a conference that was actually held here at Columbia in 1985 or 86, a number of scholars, and one of them a student actually of Bernard Lewis, said you can't use the press as a source. There was no literacy, or almost no literacy. Nobody read. So what's the importance of the press? What does it represent? And since then, I have been marshaling evidence that shows exactly what you said. My aunt wrote her memoirs and talked about how when she was a little girl in Beirut in the 1890s, her father would gather the family, especially during Ramadan at night, but also other times, and read the papers to them, or read from a magazine, a journal. There are many accounts of people in coffee shops, many accounts of the mukhtar of a village, reading out to the illiterate members of the community from newspapers and from books and so on and so forth. So circulation figures and literacy figures tell us something, but they don't really tell us anything about what the questioner asks about the size of the public space. In fact, the public space and the space of public debate was much, much larger than either literacy figures or circulation figures tell us. And we know this from other sources as well. Okay, let me see. I see a couple more questions that have just come in. I'm just going to read this one. It's from Yasmin Yakupur. She says, where does you've sort of answered this, but anyway, where does the non-Islamic Middle East stand in the distinction between Medani and Bedawi you mentioned, or a questioner mentioned actually? How do non-Islamic communities play into the Orientalization of the East by the West? So they're two sort of separate questions. You've sort of answered one, but anyway,
yeah.
Go ahead.
I think I answered that. And again, it opens a totally new topic, this Medeni and Bedevi thing. And it's not something that I treated in this book, and neither did any of the authors in their dealings with Orientalism. So it's not here, but it is a very big and important topic, and we've started looking into it.
There's a related question by Thomas Bedred. He asks, did these writers engage with fellow writers from neighboring countries on the subjects analyzed in the book? In other words, were these writers part of a regional talk on these matters? I can say a little bit about this when you've answered.
Okay. This is a really important issue, and I came across a few instances when they do that. In fact, they made life very difficult for me when Ahmet Mithat Efendi talks about his good friend Sheikh Fethullah. Who was Sheikh Fethullah? It took me so long to figure out who he was. All I knew was that he had written a book on women in Islam. And it turns out Sheikh Fethullah is an Egyptian intellectual who wrote a very important book on women's rights in Islam. And the two, my good friend Sheikh Fethullah, how does one trace that? Well, it turned out they were hanging out in Paris together at the World's Fair in 1889, and that's how they became acquainted. So I would assume that there are a few other references in my book. For example, the Grand Mufti of St. Petersburg also writes about Rana. So there are networks, and I'm hoping that as we look more and more into the non-Ottoman side, we're going to find more, of course, with the Marxist thinkers.
Right.
The connections are so obvious. There are many of them. Yeah.
Right. I think one of the things people don't realize is the extent to which there was an enormous movement of people, ideas, and publications all over the Middle East, from Istanbul to Tehran to Cairo to Beirut to Damascus and back, Izmir, all over the region. And this was facilitated by a number of things that people forget because they live in these nationalist silos. Turkey is Turkey, Egypt is Egypt, and so on and so forth. First of all, the elite of much of the Ottoman world was trained in Istanbul, whether they were Greek or they were Armenian or they were Arab or they were Kurdish or whatever their ethnicity or their languages were. The whole Egyptian and Syrian and Iraqi and so on were trained in the Milkiya, in the Harbiya, in the Tibbiya, in these grand, what we would now call universities in Istanbul. And were involved speaking Ottoman, and many Turkish leaders and individuals also spoke Arabic or spoke Kurdish, so that you multiple languages, including often Persian as well. Whether they were in Istanbul or whether they were in Tehran or whether they were in Cairo or wherever they may have been. And then the intermarriage, we forget. I mean, I don't know how many of the people of my generation and older say my Turkish grandmother, my this. Well, of course, we didn't think in those ethnic terms in those days. Greek grandmother, my Armenian, whatever. That was rather common. That there was a great deal of intermarriage. The whole Egyptian elite, for example, spoke Turkish. Their second language was French. Their third language, if they spoke it, was Arabic. And so they were reading these periodicals in Cairo, and people in Istanbul, the Arab deputies in the Ottoman and in the Meclis Mabusan, the journalists, the merchants, the students from Baghdad and from Beirut and so on and so forth. All of them spoke Ottoman, but they also were, there was Hadara, a major Arabic newspaper, was published in Istanbul. So you had people who knew Turkish, Ottoman Turkish, and who knew Arabic, and others who knew other languages. So there's an intellectual, I mean, Nader Sohrabi has a wonderful book about the interaction between the Ottoman, the Persian and the Ottoman constitutional revolutions. And he links it to the Russian Revolution of 1905. So what's happening in Russia, what's happening in Iran, what's happening in the Ottoman Empire, these things are linked. And you have people going and coming, Armenian merchants, Georgian merchants, Kazakh, I mean, one could go on and on, from all over the Russian Empire, some of them Muslims, some of them non-Muslims, going to Iran, going to the Ottoman Empire, going to what we now call the Arab world. So yes, there was, in fact, an interaction in terms of these ideas. Now, we've said a great deal about how much work would be necessary to doing parallel explorations of work in Greek, work in Arabic, work in Persian, work in Armenian, which looks at this topic. I'm not volunteering, but perhaps some of my students would be interested in doing this who control all of those, or some of those languages. I think there are a few other questions, but I think maybe we might as well stop here, because we've done, I think, a pretty good job of covering almost all of the questions that have been asked. I want to thank the Istanbul Global Center of Columbia University. I want to thank the Middle East Institute here at Columbia. I want to thank the Sabancı Center here at Columbia. I want to thank my colleague, friend, and former student, Merve, who did a wonderful job of organizing this. Seden Gülek, who is involved in this as well. And all of the others here at Columbia and in Istanbul who are a part of this. Finally, I want to thank Zeynep for bringing this wonderful, wonderful book to our attention. I hope all of you, as soon as it's available, will go out and buy it. It'll be a wonderful addition to your collections. Do you want to say anything in conclusion, Zeynep? before we wrap up?
No, I thought the questions were very insightful and opened the book up to many different venues. Thank you very much for all these intelligent questions, and thank you so much, Rashid, for doing such a superb job monitoring the question and answer period. And thank you everybody else, and Merve especially, for organizing this. It's been a very rewarding experience for me.
Thanks, everybody.
And
Goodbye.
we would also like to thank you very much and congratulate you on your new book, Professor Çelik, and thank you, Professor Khalidi, for this wonderful contribution, and to our participants for such great questions. And we would also like to thank to the Middle East Institute and the Sakıp Sabancı Center for Turkish Studies as we collaborated on this event. And the recording will be available on our website for our audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.